which means all those restaurants and cafeterias and other jobs that are connected to serving people who work in offices or other establishments, those jobs may not come back to the extent that we saw them in 2019. So there's going to be a demand for certain types of jobs that were, primarily employing, women of color. So there's a need to offer retraining and other, kinds of services to enable those women to enter other occupations that are, growing in response to the pandemic and demographic change, such as the care occupations.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I know I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I did want to just highlight Mrs. Walker's testimony and her focus on the, and I'm really proud that your youngest son was able to go back to preschool based on that child tax credit, and that's why we're working to provide those benefits for so many families. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you having this hearing. From the start of this pandemic, the number of active small businesses has plummeted, with minority and female-owned businesses disproportionately impacted. And that's because while lockdowns and temporary business closures were intended to address the public health crisis, women and minority-owned businesses were more likely to fall under the arbitrary designation of non-essential. These designations were put forward by aggressive administrations of Democrat-led governors, and therefore these businesses were forced to close with very few resources to help them get by. I look at the title of this hearing, Ensuring Women Can Thrive in a Post-Pandemic Economy. Having suffered through, in Virginia, the strict shutdown requirements of a Democratic governor, I think the answer to ensuring women can thrive in a post-pandemic economy would be to stop electing Democratic governors. But I would say that now we have the higher gas prices that are putting pressure on women, on families, and the Biden administration and Washington Democrats are trying to put the blame on the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine that began just 3 weeks ago. Gas prices started rising 40% year over year before Russia's invasion. And so I would ask our witness, who is here, and I appreciate her being here in person, how do higher gas prices impact women, particularly mothers?
Oh, absolutely. It is such an obvious, sometimes we need to look at statistics and look at the data, but ask any mom, and she knows every time she fills up the tank. Back when President Biden was elected, it was about $2 a gallon, and a couple months ago, it was $3, and now it's well over $4. And this does impact every decision, and it's pushing up, it's helping fuel what's happening in our grocery stores and across our economy. And it's interesting because I do think that, I don't want to go off field here, but when we look at energy policy, this was another big driver of this. When we look at what's happened and what's happening in the world today, the decisions that were made to reduce energy production here in the United States is a big driver of that inflation, and it is rippling through our economy and hurting women.
It absolutely is. Over the past year, women's outerwear prices and dresses are up over 11%. Women's footwear and jewelry each up over 6%. Baby food up almost 8%. Baby clothing up almost 9%. After over a year of rising prices, Democrats are continuing to dismiss and downplay the impact of inflation on everyday goods, and often falsely blaming it on car and gasoline prices. You mentioned in your testimony that back in December of 2020, more than 70% of child care centers were open, while only about a third of public K through 12 schools were fully in person. If the Democrats' proposed government-controlled child care policies and Build Back Better were in place 2 years ago, do you think government-run child care centers would have also shut down as public schools did?
Absolutely. And it's not just what happened with COVID. We talked about some of the problems that predated this pandemic. Well, certainly we've seen across the country, most recently in the city of Chicago, where there was a decision to close the schools and push everybody back to virtual learning, and I believe they just shut the doors for a while. And this is what happens when you have a system that really doesn't care whether or not how they serve those families, because it doesn't affect their budgets, it doesn't affect their livelihoods.
And as you said, the impact on women in the workforce of that type of situation would have been enormous. And so I'm glad that we avoided that. I do think we need to look at rolling back some of the red tape. It's largely going to have to be done in the states, because the states are aggressively over-regulating our child care centers, causing prices to go up. Democrats love to create a problem and then create a solution to the problem using aggressive government. And so here we go again with Democrats responsible for the rising price of childcare and now trying to cap it or in some way subsidize it with even more government intervention. So the policies of the majority party are often the problem, not the solution. And I would urge us to take a step back from that. So I appreciate the witnesses for being here, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have to respond to those last comments because I think it's also very clear that what we have going on right now is pandemic profiteering by the largest corporations. The reality is, yes, families are dealing with sticker shock. And meantime, Mr. Chairman, profits for companies that put these goods on the shelves are skyrocketing. Data from the U.S. Commerce Department shows that corporate profit margins are the largest they've been in 70 years. And even if you talk about energy costs, the reality is President Biden has called out that prices for unfinished gasoline were down by 5%, where the prices at the gas station went up by 3%. So in other words, companies are selling gas at the gas station, are increasing prices by more or not handing down price decreases that they enjoyed just a few months back in November. So anyway, I just had to correct the record on exactly where these price increases are coming from. Now, that said, I want to talk about the subject at hand, which is the disparities among women in job numbers and industries that overwhelmingly employ women like the domestic workforce. Normally, there are about 2.2 million domestic workers and 91% are women. During the pandemic, domestic workers lost jobs even as their work became more essential for seniors and for others who needed to avoid care in congregate settings. And so I think it is absolutely essential that as we work to provide an inclusive and thriving economy, we have to ensure that domestic workers are included. Ms. Pu, thank you for your work. I have argued with you in the past that our immigration system is sexclusionary, is what I call it, because it places value on work typically performed by men. Do you think that a similar systemic undervaluing of women's labor exists? And if so, can you talk about how it's hindering efforts to ensure that women are included in recovery efforts?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, and thank you for your leadership. I think the entire debate on infrastructure is a really good example of the ways in which the contributions of women to the economy and how fundamental and essential they are is devalued in a systematic way. The fact that the definition of infrastructure is that which enables the economy and society to function. Bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed, and most of the jobs that were created in the context of the infrastructure bill will go to jobs that are predominantly held by men. There is another part of investment in infrastructure that we have yet to make, which is the investment in our caregiving systems and programs that will in an infrastructure where the jobs are largely held by women, as you just named, where we can actually turn these jobs into sustainable living wage jobs and ensure affordable, high-quality access to care for the millions upon millions of working class families and working women in particular who rely on those programs. And so investing in, prioritizing, investing in our caregiving infrastructure, the way that we have invested in infrastructure, more traditional surface infrastructure, it is essential and fundamental. And the only reason why that I can see we don't see it in those terms is because we devalue the work of women. And it's really time in the 21st century that we address that. And this is an opportunity.
Let me follow up on that and just say that, we're trying to build back better. I think investing in protecting domestic workers gets at two issues: women who need the support of domestic workers to be able to do their own work outside the home, as well as the women who are doing very tough and often thankless work without the necessary support or basic rights. And you sort of referred to this. Why is supporting the domestic workforce crucial to ensuring that women can thrive in a post-pandemic economy?
Domestic workers as a workforce more than 90% women, majority women of color, were disproportionately. This is work that is, by definition, work that has to be done in person. It is not remote work. And we have seen over and over again about how essential it is. Domestic workers were an essential lifeline throughout the pandemic to some of the people who are most vulnerable to COVID-19, older people, people with disabilities, people with chronic illnesses. Enabling this workforce to be secure, to have training, to have living wages, access to a safety net, rights and protections like the ones that are included in the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights that you have championed, means that we have a set of jobs for a workforce that is overwhelmingly women. And those jobs will enable many, many other jobs throughout the economy. They will enable all kinds of essential workers, professionals throughout the economy to go to work knowing that they have access to care and the services they need inside their homes.
The work that allows all other work to happen. And it's also why it's important that we keep those investments that we had proposed in Build Back Better for elder care, for child care, for all of this kind of work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, for 5 minutes. Please unmute, Ms. Plaskett.
Yes, so much for that. And I appreciate you holding this hearing. This is, of course, extremely important to me as a Black woman. And I'm really very grateful to your leadership in recognizing that this is a topic that all women, particularly women of color, are specifically feeling the impact of. I wanted to ask Ms. Pooh a question related to post-pandemic and labor market conditions of workers. Has the labor market changed in ways that affect women's ability to succeed in their works since the post-pandemic or the late stages of the pandemic? And do we have quantifiable evidence related to that? For example, are women better able to negotiate pay, working conditions, and scheduling with their employers now? Have we seen a change?
We are still early days in terms of collecting the data that we need, Congresswoman. Thank you for the question. But what I do know anecdotally from our membership is that the lack of access to childcare, to paid family and medical leave, to paid sick days, and to health care is still a huge, huge issue for workers. And the wages for domestic workers have not increased to better enable workers to afford the care that they need for their own families. So we are still hovering at about a 22% unemployment rate among domestic workers because the quality of the jobs is not good enough for workers to be able to work and take care of the people that they love and keep themselves safe. So we will continue to collect data. I'm not sure if Dr. Albanese has more data as an economist, but from what I can tell is it's still a struggle. The American Rescue Plan investments did help. The child tax credit did help. And some of the emergency child care subsidies and emergency paid leave did help, which is why I really advocate for extending those. And it is still a struggle, and we need permanent investments in these jobs.
Well, I want to thank you for that. You know, I recognize, and statistically, we are all aware that women of color, of course, for the same jobs, earn less pay, have additional constraints in the workplace that other women do not. And thus, there are long-term effects, even if they do find another job, that still impact them and their families. In general, do the effects of employment loss end when a worker finds a new job? Or do we know the statistics on what happens to those families? The incremental changes and the incremental losses that happen to a family related to an initial job loss and that impact? And how can we, in our budget and as members of Congress, cushion American families or support them to rebound from this in the long term?
I think we've heard from Ms. Walker today about what happens when workers don't have the right supports, and she and her family are in debt as a result. And I think what we need to do is extend some of the investments that were made in the American Rescue Plan and invest in affordable, high-quality childcare, so people like Ms. Walker and our members at the National Domestic Workers Alliance can have those supports as they consider reentering the workforce.
Well, Ms. Walker has shown herself to be incredibly brave, and we are all grateful for her testimony. Dr. Albanese, do you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yes, actually, I can add a couple of things with respect to the programs that we've seen during the pandemic, including the child tax credit. One thing that economics teaches us is that for programs to change behavior of workers, they have to be sort of long-lived. So if the child credit is only in place for 6 months or 12 months, it may not be enough to change the behavior of a single mother who, is deciding whether to go back to the workforce and invest in a childcare arrangement or not. Instead, if a program is expected to last, for 2 or 3 years, that will actually change behavior. So, the predictability of these kinds of benefits is really useful so that workers can count on them and actually make appropriate choices.
Well, thank you so much for that information, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this very informative and important hearing.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. The gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of the witnesses for being here today. I want to start with you, Ms. Lucas. I want to talk about this government mandated childcare, and I want to first of all, it's funny. It seems like the majority party is always fond of declaring almost anything that they want to see happen a right, to justify it becoming something the government must guarantee. I know that this didn't evolve overnight, but it just baffles me as to how we ever reached this point where everything is a right. But anyway, now they've set their sights on government-run child and daycare. And look, I've got 6 grandchildren. The 2 youngest ones were born last year, and this is an issue that's very important to me. But I want to ask you, Ms. Lucas, what would happen if the majority party, the Democrats, got their way and mandated a government child care program?
Well, I am concerned that it would change the dynamic where instead of daycare and childcare providers being focused on providing for the family and serving the family, that they would be much more focused on serving regulators and on public policy officials. So it would operate more like the K through 12 public schools. And if I can, I would have a moment of caution because there's a lot of discussion about what an investment childcare is and how it leads to tremendous returns on investment. And yet nobody brings up Head Start, and that is the existing federal program which spends about $10,000 per child and serves thousands of children. And there have been congressionally mandated studies to see, is this investment paying off in terms of lasting school readiness? Do you see gains? And any gains that these congressionally mandated studies have shown that any benefits fade out over time. The programs that people point to show this tremendous return on investment are small programs and that served extremely disadvantaged communities. In fact, there was just a study done of a program in Tennessee that they were hopeful that they were going to see some real returns on this. And in fact, they found again that not only did it not have positive effects, that it was actually associated with negative effects. And I'll be sure to pass this on so that the information on that study is available to everyone here, because I think it is very telling and cautionary. It doesn't mean that preschool can never be good or daycare can never yield investments, but we should be rather humble about knowing that government programs are going to provide this return on investment.
Well, thank you for that input, and we look forward to getting that information from you. I've been going through this. I haven't been going through it, but my sons and their families have been going through the process of going to different daycare centers and seeing the very diversity of them and making a decision based on, hey, we like this, we like that, and this is what we want to try to get. How do you think the curriculum would be changed if we had government mandated daycare centers, Ms. Lucas? And could working parents maintain flexibilities, do you think, with private child care centers?
You know, I would be very concerned that, especially when it comes to right now, currently about 50% of child cares are faith-based. And I think those would have a lot of trouble with mandates made by state governments, that those would be kind of pushed out of the marketplace. And I do think we would see a lot like K through 12 schools. It would become much more cookie cutter. You know, we have seen over the past several decades a steep decline in at-home childcare, which is something the parents really want. There was almost 50%, I believe it was a 50% decline between 2005 and 2016 in the number of at-home daycare providers. We need to take a hard look at the regulations that are making it impossible for those small businesses to stay in business, because there is a lot of regulatory overreach, and we would have a greater diversity if we were able to remove that red tape.
So you would agree that it's important to have a diversity of institutions to serve parents and their kids. You know, I mean, I'm so relieved to hear you say this, because this is such a big decision for parents. My daughter-in-law is Catholic. My son is Methodist and a Protestant, and you know, they're interviewing all these different daycare centers and putting such thought and so much time into making these kind of decisions, and it's really such a fascinating thing to watch in this. And my fear is that that's going to go away, and that we're just going to have cookie cutter child care centers anymore. Any comment on that, Ms. Lucas?
I do worry about that. And I'll just have one more really quick. I know that the time's almost up, but you should look at the mask policies, because I think one of the things that's a tremendous tragedy is how we have kept our youngest children masked. Everybody here has the freedom to take off their masks, yet the kids sitting in Head Start are still forced to wear masks, even though it's impeding their learning development, impeding their speech. I think it's terrible, and I'm terribly concerned about that being the wave of the future if the Build Back Better child care program went into effect.
Thank you, Ms. Lucas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Next in line is Ms. Jackson Lee, but her camera is not on. If you are there, Ms. Jackson Lee, okay, you are there. Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a crucial meeting. Obviously, there's much going on. Let me ask also the doctor, but let me make this point as I appreciate the witness who indicated that there would be a problem with trying to provide a 7% top of how much families, women, would pay for childcare. And because women's salaries, sometimes heads of households, are lower than men, if you will, even as heads of households, I'm stunned that this would not be a positive. Clearly, good childcare would not be spending their time focusing on government regulations. They'd be spending their time being grateful of the quality of childcare that would generate by securing federal funding. And the amount of people maximized beyond Head Start. Head Start is a governmental program. Childcare is not a governmental program. Childcare is giving people access to childcare wherever they are. So, Ms. Poole, let me ask you this question. What kind of seismic change would come about, for example, if you invested through, say, the Build Back Better Act in lowering childcare costs so that women could reimagine their lives through new training, education, longer hour jobs? How would that improve the economic condition of children and women? And then additionally, could you find anything negative to having provisions that would increase the opportunity for childcare and lower the cost? My third question is, you may not be a Head Start expert, but I'm not really seeing those numbers. I guess I'll have to explore that to say that their impact fades out. Well, you want the impact to be as they leave Head Start and go into elementary school, and then they're left in the hands of good teachers, and hopefully they'll move on with that foundation. But Ms. Poole, can you answer my first question, please? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the questions, Congresswoman. I think that making childcare more affordable would be nothing short of transformative in the lives of women. And right now, women are spending between 9 and 40% of their income on childcare. And so not having to spend more than 7% of their incomes means that there's more income to pay for nutritious food, to pay for for a rainy day, to pay off the debts like the ones that Ms. Walker has accumulated. It would be nothing short of transformative for women and their entire families, and for the ability to transfer generational wealth, to create economic mobility so that one generation can do better than the next. I think there's so many ripple effects that we will see, beginning from having less pressure on your pocketbook, which is absolutely essential in the short term to achieve. The cost of childcare is one of the most significant fixed costs for families right now. If we want to lower costs for families, making childcare affordable is the way to do it. And I've never heard any data that the impact of Head Start fades over time. In fact, I've heard the opposite. And I've encountered so many people across professions who have benefited from the Head Start program that has allowed them to actually have an equal footing as they enter public school.
Well, thank you for that. Let me conclude my remarks. First of all, Mr. Chairman, this was a long overdue and very vital hearing to focus on women. There are several elements of the Build Back Better Act. We contributed to its construction. I think the Budget Committee did an excellent job. But to make the care economy real, women who care for people, make it a profession, increase the salaries of the women who had to stay out of the workplace, but they could come back to the workplace with a professional, skilled industry of care workers. I believe that that combination, childcare, will put women on a sure footing, no matter what their educational level is and what level of job they have. There are many women bosses who need childcare as well, and there are many women who work day to day, hour to hour, that need childcare. And so I hope we can move this forward. Thank you very much. Ms. Poole, thank you for your testimony and also for the witnesses. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra, for 5 minutes.
Hey, thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Smith. I want to thank each one of our witnesses for their testimony today. And I share your concerns that we need our kids to have a great education, and our economy recovery cannot exclude women who are trying to find work. You know, one of the toughest problems facing my constituents in Iowa is the lack of childcare. And we just talked about this. I hear question after question about childcare. So it's great that we're talking about this topic. There's a lot of work being done in this space with our Iowa governor working to find solutions to ensure that moms aren't forced to stay home. However, one of the key drivers of this problem in my state is a lack of workforce. And that hasn't been talked about a lot today, right? We have a lack of workforce. We have a lack of staff for our child care. Our unemployment in Iowa is at 3.7%, and for women, it's 2.8%. That's because Iowans avoided some of the pitfalls that a lot of other states had when they recovered from this pandemic. You know what? For Iowa, we kept our schools open to ensure that our kids are getting a great education. And our parents weren't forced to struggle between feeding their family and keeping their kids on track, right? Our schools were open. Studies agree with this. And the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis found that nearly 70% of mothers in states that shuttered schools were forced out of work compared to mothers living in states that kept schools open. Isn't that amazing? You know, the states that shuttered all of a sudden had this massive problem, but the states that didn't don't have this problem. Second, Iowa didn't double or triple down on its harmful lockdown policies after medicines became available. You know, we went mask free. We just heard earlier how important that was for kids. The rising crisis that is starting to crush moms across this country is inflation. Just yesterday, it was announced that the the wholesale inflation rose by 10% over last year. Gas up 40%. Heating your home is up 15%. Expense after expense on that bottom line for families. Flooding the country with trillions of spending is making American lives worse. A budget committee we showed actively accounting for the trillions we have printed to recommend recessions of unspent funds. And this is just, again, another hidden tax. It's inflationary cost because of all this money we dumped in the system. Ms. Lucas, you've talked a lot about this already, and I appreciate all your comments. But do you have any thoughts or ideas when it comes to childcare and workforce and how we can help the workforce out? To me, the bottom line for us in Iowa is the childcare industry just simply needs workforce. What is your thoughts on that?
I do think that it's important to talk about kind of those supply side effects when it comes to labor. And there's an interesting study, I think, the Heritage Foundation's Rachel Getzler wrote a piece that looked at some of this, and she notes that states that ended the unemployment insurance bonuses in July 2021 or earlier experienced a significantly greater pace of employment recovery in July and August than the states that hadn't. And she estimates that if the economy of all the states had ended those unemployment bonuses earlier, we would have had 800,000 more jobs gained in July and August. I do think it's important. We've talked a lot about the need. Everybody supports helping people. We want there to be a robust safety net. But we need to make sure that that safety net is a safety net, not one that impedes people from returning to work. Because as some of my fellow witnesses have talked about, we need people in the childcare industry, that it is these jobs create jobs, and we need to make sure that the incentives are right so that we're not discouraging labor force participation permanently.
Yeah, thanks, Mrs. Lucas. I greatly appreciate those comments. And you said something very valuable, and this is very seldom gets talked about, but if you're a family like me, I have a family of 4, I got 4 children. When you're doing your monthly budget and all these items are drastically going up, it really limits what you can do. And it really pinches daycare because you just don't have the dollars to do it. Now, you can throw more dollars in. That's very, very temporary. And obviously what we've seen is that just created more inflation. It creates higher cost of product. So it's just, to me, being in economics, this is not the way we do things. I mean, it's just wrong on so many levels. So with that, I yield back and thank you again for each one of your testimonies.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing really should be called How Recent Government Policies Have Hurt Americans, Women Included, because it's hurt women just as much as every other American to have our most basic freedoms that we couldn't have imagined being under assault and under attack even just 2 or 3 years ago from what we've seen in the last couple of years. But our most basic freedoms, like our freedom of movement, our freedom to travel. Even today, we don't have true freedom to travel without wearing a mask. Our freedom of assembly, getting together. Heck, even in this room, we don't have everybody in the hearing room. They're doing it by Zoom. This Congress votes by proxy. We continue to use the China virus as an excuse to have these emergency provisions, which we all know are not necessary. Our most basic freedom just to earn a living, to operate our business, to go to work, to keep our job. Our freedom to worship, and our freedom to educate our children or have our children go to school and to be there in person. These have been trampled upon and harmed our children, harmed our families, harmed mothers, harmed women in general. History will judge us harshly by how we've sacrificed our children on the altar of politics over these last 2 years. You touched on it just a few moments ago, but the fact that we would close schools for children who are at almost no risk to the virus, for 2 years. Kids are at home or trying to learn remotely when they're at almost no risk to the virus. We've treated everybody the same. We've treated children like senior citizens. We've treated college students like those with multiple comorbidity factors. How do we ever make up for these mothers, these women's children? How do we ever make up the lost learning for 2 years? So they graduate, with just 2 years less of school. Not to mention the developmental delay, the social delay, the emotional issues that have come in there. In my home county, we lifted the mask mandate, thankfully, finally. It should have never been in place. It's child abuse. put a child in a mask all day long when we know masks don't make any difference. That's why no one who's been enforcing it all this time ever wears it when no one's looking. It's virtue signaling. That's even, I saw a doctor on CNN say, hey, it just shows what team you're on. It's virtue signaling. It just sends a message that you care when you wear your mask. But to do that to children all day long when they're almost no risk for the virus, and also we know from studies that masks don't make any difference. But in my home county of Campbell County outside Lynchburg in the 5th District of Virginia, half the kids are still wearing masks when they don't have to. Why? Because we've told them they're going to die from the virus. And they've gotten comfortable with this thing on their face. In the meantime, for women across this country, these policies that have made them less secure with the border invasion that we have not just allowed to happen, we've caused to happen by this government's policies, our weakness on the national stage, where as we look across the ocean to Ukraine, what's happening there, or the threat of China, the threat of North Korea, the threat of Iran, and the American weakness that's been projected, the massive spending that's robbing women, Americans and families of their purchasing power, costing them thousands of dollars a year more now than it did previously, last year, just to buy the essentials. Grocery prices through the roof, gas prices through the roof, as we've declared war on American energy. These policies are harmful to women. The crime explosion in this country, undermining our police. Not to mention, we have fired women for not getting vaccines, not allowed them to keep their job as essential healthcare workers, not allowed them to stay in the military, not allowed them to stay in law enforcement, not allowed them to provide for the family, because we've taken away their right, again, trampled on their right to their most basic freedom of their own health decisions, and then we fired them if they didn't do what their government wanted them to do. So I know you're chomping at the bit to respond, Ms. Lucas. I'll let you just respond to any additional thoughts you might have.
I appreciate that. And I do think when we look at the decisions we've made about our children, it contrasts very much with the rest of the world. When you look at, we've talked a little bit about European systems and what they do to support families. Well, one thing they didn't do was to put little kids in masks. Even the WHO had said that masking children under age 5 was not recommended, was bad, was not just not recommended, but was harmful. And through most of Europe, they have long had something where a policy that children under the age of 11 or 12 do not wear masks. I do think that we're going to see tremendous mental health impacts from this. We see now there was a 51% in girls, teenage girls, attempted suicides during these last 2 years, and this is something we're going to be living with, damaging effects for a really long time.
And we're not telling the truth about the risk of the virus, which I heard Dr. Ben Carson say was the most dangerous virus in the most dangerous. We're not telling the truth about the risk of the vaccine, which I heard Dr. Ben Carson say is the most dangerous vaccine in history, and we're forcing it upon children who had almost no risk for the virus. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for 5 minutes.
Well, first of all, Ms. Lucas, I'd like to thank you for being here. You know, I know most of the people back home in Wisconsin, where I'm from, they go to work in the day and they make it do. And I'm sure it would have been easier for you to just call it in and do this from your kitchen table. But I think, you know, you really can tell a lot more or learn about a lot more when somebody's here and in person. So I'd like to thank you for understanding that and being here. Couple comments here. During this pandemic, a lot of people were mandated vaccine-wise. And I certainly got calls from many nurses. I have such a high opinion of nurses. I thought it was so offensive and un-American to force them to get the vaccine. I know a lot of nurses who quit, particularly if they were concerned it might have an effect on a pregnancy down the line. I met with a doctor earlier today. He was concerned about that. And I could just envision a bunch of guys sitting around at NIH or CDC or whatever saying, well, everybody can have the vaccine. Do you think the fear of a negative effect on the vaccine is something that, particularly because so many of them work in the healthcare field, disproportionately hurt women?
Well, certainly when it comes to fertility issues, that was something that I know a lot of women personally were very concerned with, because this is, you can be somebody who supports the concept of a vaccine and wants people to get vaccinated, but when it comes to our kids and our fertility, there's a lot of questions, and so we need to let free people make their decisions.
Right, and when I go through a hospital, I certainly see more women working there than men overall. And I wondered if there wasn't a little bit of tacit sexism going on there when they cracked down and told everybody who works in the hospital, but women in particularly, that they would have to lose their jobs if they didn't get a vaccine. I was very offended, but I just wondered if you had any other comments on that.
Well, I think that, again, we've learned a lot during the course of this pandemic, and one of the things we've really learned in the last several months in the wake of Omicron is that the vaccine's protection is for you personally, and it has not been preventing the spread of the disease, which makes it all the more, I think, inappropriate to force people to not have the opportunity to work and support themselves merely because they make a different health choice and weigh their own risks differently than the government does.
We have all sorts of statistics before us today. Do you know any general statistics as far as percentage-wise women and percentage of men who want to stay out of the workforce and take care of their kids?
I think that it's actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think we've talked a little bit and heard some about the wage gap, and it was actually a holiday the other day called Equal Pay Day that is often used as a proxy to talk about how much women are underpaid systemically. The truth is that a lot of women, a lot of that is not discrimination, but is because women often do decide to prioritize things other than earning and want to stay home with their kids, and we should respect that. That's why I think it's important for any support that's given to families when people with young kids isn't made conditional on hiring somebody else to care for your kids. We should be providing support and recognizing the value of people who do choose to stay home.
Why do you think some people dislike women? I mean, I think it's fine. When I grew up, my mom was at home more often than not. Why do you think there's this dislike for women who are staying at home with their kids?
It's funny. I think that sometimes there's this almost like, I think, a myth of the mommy wars, that I think when you talk to actual women, that, I'm a working mom and I know some stay-at-home moms, and they are fully staying at home moms, and they're the people who bail me out when I can't get there to pick up my kids, and they are the ones who help so much in the classrooms. And I think there's a lot more respect. I fear from a public policy standpoint, sometimes there is a lack of respect, but I do think it comes from elites, that it's not on the ground moms, because I think on the ground moms respect the decisions that other women make.
And if a stay-at-home mom, say she decides to work part-time or not work overtime or whatever, that winds up statistically look like that there's something wrong with our society, right? I mean, if some woman's taking the professional track and some woman professional but maybe working 20 hours a week, or when that runs through the statistics, they claim that there's something wrong with our society for allowing women to stay at home or allowing women to work part-time. Do you think that means there's something wrong with our society?
No, I think that in my old women's studies classes, they would have talked about this conversation as having a really male lens, just judging everyone by how much money they earn, where a lot of women focus on other things, and including they value the time they get to spend with their kids.
Yeah, I think people who just look solely at money are shallow, and I've always felt that way. Okay, well, again, thank you for being here today. It was very nice for you to come on down and talk to us in person.
Yeah. Gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is good to be back. I love how Congress schedules all committee hearings all at the same time. Such a use of efficiency here in the nation's capital. I'm quite sure everybody watching C-SPAN right now hears all my sarcasm. I just want to jump into it. Obviously, we have a limited amount of time. First of all, look, the American Rescue Plan, when it was written so fast after the president was inaugurated, it was an excuse, in my view, to essentially unleash long-held policy ideals from people on the political left that they've wanted to accomplish for quite some time. And so the pandemic was the crisis not being let go to waste. It was pretty clear from economists all across the spectrum that if we actually passed that piece of legislation, and we talked about it here in the Budget Committee, that if we passed that piece of legislation, it would lead to inflationary pressures in the United States. Obviously, Larry Summers' comments have been proven to be very accurate. His comments today about a potential Federal Reserve interest rate hike is that if the Federal Reserve does not do this quickly in an appropriate manner, we are going to enter a period of stagflation in the United States. And so the point I want to really bring us home for the witnesses here, and I'm going to ask you guys about this stuff, is, Ms. Poe, I want to make sure I pronounce your last name correctly. But I know that, you and your organization have advocated for, I'm assuming, permanency in the child tax credit. But my question for you is, even if you have permanency in the child tax credit, but the United States enters a period of stagflation, where inflationary pressures continue to be high, don't these families that receive this advancement of a tax credit, isn't the purchasing power of the dollars they receive already going to be eroded from higher inflation rates in the United States, which come from passage of this policy to begin with? And many others, by the way.
I think actually Dr. Albanese is probably in a better position to answer questions about how inflation works long term. But what I will say is that we are paying for care, specifically, which is my area of expertise, in incredibly costly, inefficient, and ineffective ways.
Well, I'll get, because I only got 2 minutes, so we're going to have to plug and play here. And I apologize. I wish we did this differently, where we weren't tied to 5-minute segments, but I don't set the rules. My point is that, listen, I get it. Listen, I had 3 kids. I pay childcare. I know what it is. It is a car payment. Sometimes it's a Mercedes payment, depending on where you live and what you're doing. Been there, done it. I got the checks. I've written the checks. I know what I'm talking about. I know you do as well. My point is that when you interject with massive amounts of governmental spending, specifically to childcare, and you're chasing childcare, what actually ends up happening is the cost of childcare will actually increase as a result of additional federal stimulus. Look no further than the university system in the United States. We essentially subsidize federal student loans because we think it's in the best interest of students. But what it also does, it allows universities and colleges to raise their tuition rates because they know that there is essentially a pot of unlimited dollars chasing university slots and being able to pay tuitions, which, the good doctor, obviously, through her work, sees on a day-to-day basis. And that's also spiraled into a student loan crisis. I guess, look, at the end of the day, and Dr. Albanese, that's correct?
Albanese, yes.
Albanese. You said earlier that with respect to people coming out of the workforce, there was really a differentiation between college graduates and non-college graduates. In your studies, was it college versus non-college? And amongst the college segment, was there a differentiation between men and women? Because you didn't say that in that answer. I just want to expound upon that. Is a differentiation between in the non-college graduates, men versus women, versus college graduates, men and women, or really is there no differentiation at all with respect to academic attainment?
No, there is some differentiation. So most of the decline in participation of women is coming from women without a college degree, but there was a slight decline also for women with a college degree, but it was temporary and very short-lived. And as I mentioned earlier in response to another question, where we saw the decline in participation was not, again, women quitting their job, but women becoming unemployed and then deciding that, they weren't going to search for a new job, perhaps because of childcare challenges or other issues, including not having sufficient protection from infection in a care job where they were
Doctor,
very
I
exposed.
appreciate your answer. I really, really do. I'm already out of time. I'm abusing the chairman's time right now. Only thing I would add to your point is, yes, it goes without question that there are many people who are out of the workforce because we literally shut down the economy in the United States. And I would argue, especially if you are the woman in the household and you're in an industry that Ms. Poe represents, you were first on the chopping block because you're service oriented. And if people are basically locked in their houses, then those service jobs are no longer needed. So I don't really think that it's appropriate to say that that's about men versus women. That's much more appropriate to say that it's about governmental policy and how you shut down an economy. And it actually had the most impacts on women as a result of the policy decisions that were made in shutting down an economy, which is why we shouldn't be shutting down economies. But I digress and I yield back.
Okay, gentleman's time has expired, and I will remind the gentleman that he has the right to submit any questions to the witnesses that he didn't get to for the record. And you submitted them within a week. we would do it. I now yield myself 10 minutes. And I love going last because I get to push back against a lot of things, but also I'm going to start in an uncharacteristic way, and I'm going to agree with my Republican colleagues on two things. One is we do need to provide much better oversight over everything the government does. That's been one of my biggest complaints since I've been here, and now that I'm on my way out, I will repeat it. We don't spend nearly enough time dealing with the impact and the effectiveness of the actions we take. Been true before the American Rescue Plan, and I will remind everyone that the American Rescue Plan really has not been in effect for a year yet. So the question is, when do you make when do you conduct that oversight? And I'm not sure we're actually ready to do that because a lot of decisions are still being made as to how that money is spent. The second thing I will agree with some of the comments my colleagues has been the question of the supply side aspect of things like childcare. I stressed this over and over with the administration as we were developing the American Rescue Plan, that we have to focus as much on building capacity as we do on helping our citizens afford the service. Because if we don't create capacity, and that's true of early childhood education, it's true of senior care, regardless of what it is, that all we're doing is providing much more money to chase not an increased number of opportunities, and that will necessarily lead to inflation. So that said, I'm finished agreeing with my Republican colleagues, and I want to push back on a few things. One is I know that the ranking member talks a lot about how only 9% of the American Rescue Plan was spent on actual COVID treatment and combating COVID. But virtually all of the American Rescue Plan was designed to deal with the impact of COVID. And for instance, $122 billion to help schools reopen, which we all want to do, which is a high priority of Republicans and Democrats, $122 billion to make sure that schools can reopen safely and effectively. And part of that $122 billion was for remedial education, which many of the schools are now trying to figure out how to do. So, the biggest complaint I get now from some of my citizens is they're trying to get one program or another financed through the American Rescue Plan, and the government is telling them, no, that's not COVID related. So I would take issue with the characterization, although with the way you've expressed it, you're technically correct. Now I want to talk about inflation and gas prices. Everybody has an idea of what causes inflation, and the American Rescue Plan is an easy target, although on the one hand you say so much of the American Rescue Plan hasn't been spent yet, and then you blame it for creating inflation. You got to have it one way or the other. But I know I love the way Mr. Donald said, economists across the spectrum believe this, but the only economist who's been mentioned today taking issue with the American Rescue Plan and inflation has been Lawrence Summers. And so I would look to cite some other economists like Moody's Analytics, which said, now this is a few weeks ago, this is prior to whatever has happened to gas prices. I will qualify that. But as of a few weeks ago, Moody's Analytics said that the American Rescue Plan was responsible for less than 1% of the inflation we're experiencing, something like 0.6%. And the Fed in San Francisco did a similar study and came up with the same answer. So Mr. Smucker wanted to have a hearing on the causes of inflation. I think it would be very instructive to do that because I think you'd find a lot of different answers and a lot of different opinions as to what's responsible for how much of the inflation. Again, we've talked a lot about Republican governors and Democratic governors, and Mr. Dog had talked about his opinion of the Texas governor. I have a great governor. He's a Democratic governor. The state legislature is 75% Republican. So, it's kind of hard to call Kentucky a red state, a blue state by any stretch of the imagination, although our Kentucky governor has done a great job. And when you contrast it, not with some of the metrics that have been mentioned here today, but with the issue of number of cases per capita, number of cases overall, percentage of hospitalizations, number of deaths, I think you would find that the states that have done the worst in terms of preventing damage, health consequences to their citizens, they've been Republican-led states, and not Democratic-led states. Finally, I want to talk about gas prices. You talked about gas prices and suggested, Mrs. Lucas, some of the things we ought to do. Do you know how many barrels of oil the United States is producing today?
I don't.
Okay, it's over 12 million barrels a day. Do you know where that ranks among all the countries in the world?
No,
Number one. We produce more oil on a daily basis right now than Russia, than Saudi Arabia, and every other country. And so to say that somehow the policies that apparently Joe Biden has put in place over the last 13 and a half months that he's been in office have done damage to our production of energy is not borne out by the facts. And in fact, we're producing more oil now than we ever did under Donald Trump, than we ever have done under any other president, Republican or Democrat. And in addition, there are 9 million acres of licensed drilling opportunities in the United States right now. And I don't think that any Republican or Mrs. Lucas would want us to have a Gazprom, a government-sponsored oil company, doing the drilling. We have private enterprise in this country. They make the decisions as to when to drill, when it is in their economic interest to drill and to produce oil. They're doing that right now. I don't necessarily blame. I think, there's been a current spike that's actually receded because of the invasion of Ukraine, but I don't think I don't call it Putin's inflation of oil prices. That's an international market which we don't control, but we're doing our best to accommodate. I want to thank Ms. Walker for her very compelling story, and I know that is a story that is true of many, many women throughout the country. And I do want to make one comment, and that is, because it's important that everybody realizes this, you may or may not know, but the child tax credit expansion has not ended. The monthly checks have ended. There are 6 months more of child tax credit expansion this year. You have to file a tax return to get it. But the same criteria, you don't have to make money, you just have to, you don't have to have an income or taxable income, you just have to file the return. And speaking to the CBO director last week, there was a very encouraging sign that he said only about 6%, he thought right now is the estimate of those who are eligible, have not taken advantage of that. So I want to make sure that people, if they haven't, do take advantage of it. In the remaining time, I do want to ask a question of Dr. Albanese. You mentioned the child penalty that was up to 40%. Could you explain a little bit about how what's in that 40%? How do you get to that 40%?
Basically, it's how much women's wages drop 3 years or more after having their first child as a result of having become mothers. And it's 40%, as I said, and it contributes to the largest fraction of the gender wage gap overall. And it is a combination of both career choices, labor supply, and also forced career choices that women make, as well as outright discrimination in some types of occupations. But it's why, in most, households, mothers tend to be the lower earning, member of the household, two-earner couple. And it's also why, single mothers, have more trouble making ends meet compared to maybe single fathers because they are paid less. So it is, a substantial. The United States is not the only country where this exists. Unfortunately, it's very common amongst comparable countries, though it varies quite a bit across countries depending on, the wage structure and so on.
Great. One final comment before I close, and that is my daughter-in-law is in the child care business. She has a daycare center with her mother and grandmother. They run it. And one of the things that Kentucky did with the ARP money was to set up a fund to help support child care. And what that has enabled my daughter-in-law's business to do is actually to compete on salary with other businesses, and she's now able to pay them a competitive wage. She's having a much easier time, although I wouldn't characterize it easy. She's having a less difficult time finding qualified personnel to work in the daycare center, and so that's been a positive way that the American Rescue Plan has helped support childcare, again, going through Kentucky government. So with that, I only went 17 seconds over my time, and I was very lenient with the other side, and I'm not going to let everybody go and get lunch. But I want to once again thank all of our witnesses. I will take issue with the one comment that we learn more from a witness. Mr. Grothman said we learn more from a witness in the room than we do from virtually. I wouldn't say that's necessarily true. It would be nice to have all the witnesses in the room. I agree, it does create a better dialogue, but I think we've learned a lot from our virtual witnesses as well. So if there's no further business, I thank the witnesses for their testimony and responses, and this meeting, without objection, is adjourned.
Fellow Americans, good morning. Certain dates echo throughout history, including dates that instantly remind all who have lived through them where they were and what they were doing when our democracy came under assault. Dates that occupy not only a place on our calendars, but a place in our collective memory. December 7th, 1941, September 11th, 2001, and January 6th, 2021. On that day, I was not only Vice President-elect, I was also a United States Senator. And I was here at the Capitol that morning at a classified hearing with fellow members of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Hours later, the gates of the Capitol were breached. I had left, but my thoughts immediately turned not only to my colleagues, but to my staff, who had been forced to seek refuge in our office, converting filing cabinets into barricades. What the extremists who roamed these halls targeted was not only the lives of elected leaders. What they sought to degrade and destroy was not only a building, hallowed as it is. What they were assaulting were the institutions, the values, the ideals that generations of Americans have marched, picketed, and shed blood to establish and defend. On January 6th, we all saw what our nation would look like if the forces who seek to dismantle our democracy are successful. The lawlessness, the violence, the chaos. What was at stake then and now is the right to have our future decided the way the Constitution prescribes it, by we, the people, all the people.